Welcome to this second plenary lecture, second and last but not least. I have the pleasure of welcoming our fellow colleague and friend Karin Hannes from the KU Leuven, the very close by University of Leuven. Both universities, by the way, are celebrating this year their 600th anniversary. It's a long story. Both universities, as a single university, were founded in 1425. Technically, there was a small interruption right after the French Revolution, but the spirit has been there for 600 years. And now there are two distinct institutions, KU Leuven and UC Louvain, with a lot of cross collaborations today. Okay, so let me introduce our friend and colleague Karin Hannes. He's a sociologist by training, right? Social sciences?
Transdisciplinary.
Yeah, transdisciplinary now, but you were initially trained in
health sciences, future studies, social welfare, and education.
Okay, quite diverse. The way that Karin has developed her agenda is indeed very transdisciplinary, and she also wants to connect social sciences with other disciplines and the arts, and how these different disciplines may feed the future and may inform the future also for policy and for civil society. And in particular, she advocates co-creative research approaches where different players may intervene and who together can contribute and produce social change in society. And Karin develops and promotes and acts an activist inclusive perspective in her work. And she combines her work with societal engagement. She also has a very specific methodological domains of innovation that she will discuss about today. And she chairs specifically a network called the European Network of Qualitative Inquiry. And she also develops specific space, a free space for lateral thinkers, which she may perhaps define in her talk. Lateral thinkers in the town of Leuven. So thank you very much for coming. We are honored, and I give you the floor.
Let me start with lateral thinkers because it wouldn't come back in my presentation. But I strongly believe in a science model where people from society are also part of my knowledge circle. So that sometimes means that you need to transport a sort of or create a space that is open to the public for shared knowledge building. So lateral thinkers are actually free thinkers that can cross between disciplines, and that's where the interesting stuff happens, I guess. I wanted to introduce myself by bracketing out my particular methodological angle. I come very much into debates from a creative qualitative research perspective. At least that is what I identify myself with at this point. But I've been surrounded by quantitative scholars, artists, and people from all sorts of disciplines. So I do understand many, many jargons, and I've been long enough around to also be, or let myself be confused from time to time. And when you are confused, then there's a sort of disruption taking place in you. That's the point where most of the innovative thinking is starting to happen. So I very much built my presentation on these points of disruption. So my assignment was actually to talk about quality assessment. I think that's an interesting point that many of us share. And the most important term, I guess, in my title today is the idea of truth, particularly when this lecture is about quality. Because defining truth in relation to quality criteria for research designs involves actually an understanding how it is conceptualized within different paradigms of research and how it then informs criteria by which that research is evaluated. And in traditional paradigms of research, such as quant and qual research, truth is more or less presented as an abstract concept. It is sort of linked to, based on logic or language, and represented through numbers and narratives. I added a very specific term to the concept truth today, which is tangibility, because tangible truth extends this notion of truth towards things and stuff that is created in research praxis. So it shifts the focus towards more material, embodied realities that surround us. And it suggests that truth is not just something we say or think in relation to numbers and narratives collected through empirical research, but it is also something we can touch and feel or encounter through matter. And matter does not always translate too well onto the printed page through which we communicate with each other. It presents itself as a different piece of evidence to consider in research. What I thought about doing today, and the arrows don't work, so maybe I'll try something else. Okay, yeah, there we go. What I thought about doing today is walk you through a catwalk of quality assessment criteria for different methodological designs. And hopefully that leads you to some pathways that you haven't explored yet, which give you inspiration to maybe take your agenda elsewhere from time to time or search new ways of collaborating with different types of scholars. And hopefully it also leads to some interesting follow-up conversations between people standing for different paradigms. And that's actually what I came for. So don't hesitate to initiate these. Besides that catwalk, I also want to draw attention to a particular phase in the research cyclus. I know that when we think about quality, we mainly focus on a couple of phases, you know. It's about the question, it's about how we collect data, how we analyze data, perhaps also the way we publish and what the quality of that publication outline is. But very seldomly do we focus on maybe the quality of what has become very important in grant proposals, something like public outreach. You know, what is good public outreach? Everyone asks us to do that, but we have no measures to actually guide us in what good public outreach would be. So I'll end my conversation by tapping into that. For those who are unfamiliar with reporting criteria, we do have let's say, a worldwide network called Equator. If you go to that network, you find reporting guidance for articles of all kinds of designs, and they guide you through the writing, but they are also heavily used by peer evaluators. So it's worthwhile to just go and check that, but I'm not going into that today. The order of things I will showcase on my catwalk are actually not informed by you know, priority or by the weight they have. It's just simply the way I encountered them from being a very young scholar up to the point where I am now. So it's sort of a chronological order of tipping points in my career, if you like, where I switched paradigm or where I adopted another paradigm in. In scholarly terms, though, when I think back to my younger self, I was born as a scholar and raised in the 90s in a faculty of medicine. And that's where the whole field of science started to shift from authority-based decision-making to actually an evidence-based movement. And that movement promoted the use of high-quality evidence as a solid basis to support decision-making. And I was actually in the position to try and establish a Belgian Center for Evidence-Based Medicine that would teach practitioners how to do that. And in many cases, I was only one step ahead of them. of those I was teaching. I knew nothing about that. It was completely new to us as well. But I long lived with this idea that there was only one type of research design that was capable of providing robust research results, and that was the randomized controlled trial promoted by that movement, because it was labeled as the golden standard in research, and we were all encouraged to consider that. So where did that leave me as a young scholar, being assigned a job to conduct qualitative research on barriers and facilitators towards the evidence-based movement? It actually suggests also that I shared my workspace with colleagues who mainly worked from a deductive perspective, offering a clear hypothesis or a clear focus in the variables at play in their research, or comparing effects of different interventions. So for them, reality was something that was objective, and measurement. It's like, you have a window somewhere, everyone looks through the window and you see the same reality. That was the point of view. And reality was objectively measurable. It existed independent of human perception. So they took the idea that phenomena can be observed, quantified, generalized as well, for granted, and that the world was somehow governed by cause-effect relationships that can be discovered through systematic inquiry. And actually, I quite fancied that idea because it made my life less complex. It was a simple model. And I remember how that was translated in quality terms. We actually, the general quality criteria we played with, and through we distinguished good from bad or lower from higher quality evidence, were validity and reliability. And I remember us finding this chart, this image, and putting it in practice, playing darts with a group of colleagues we engaged, and trying to explain through validity and reliability concept how the dart was actually compositions. So actually the first term was reliability, and that comes very close to the idea of repeatability. A good practice that can be found in the first and maybe also in the last dartboard that you see. You aim for consistent results over multiple times of measurement, and this surely strengthens our level of confidence in the findings. Validity is a bit more complicated, to my opinion, because it refers to the ability to produce actually credible results. And very often I encountered the explanation that a study is valid when it measures what it's supposed to measure. And I thought that was a given. You don't necessarily throw a hockey stick in a baseball game either, or you don't throw a ball into a tennis play. It was such an evident principle, but it's actually about much more. It also refers to the degree to which evidence and theory actually support the interpretations that we make, and whether or not we jump to conclusions too fast. To give you an example, when we assess reading fluency in education and we measure the length of the youngsters, we might as well find a correlation between reading fluency and length, because those who are taller are usually also a bit older. And so it explains why they are more fluid. So it's not because the correlation is there that we would necessarily use then height measurement as a proxy for reading fluency. So we need to be careful, and these were the things I actually grew up with in terms of quality markers. Added to that was the idea of external validity, which often translates into generalizability beyond a specific context, beyond particular populations, and also the notion of objectivity, that the role of the researcher should be very limited. You should sort of set yourself aside from the scene that you are studying, because if you're not and you're too involved, you introduce some sort of a researcher bias. And as a young scholar, that's quite intimidating. So you try to make sense of that in your little qualitative bubble of trying to speak with people about barriers and facilitators. And for a long time, I have used these measures to look at other designs as well, and many people have done so because there was no clear consensus about what good criteria could be. In the meanwhile, a lot of criteria have actually been developed for different designs, yet it still slips through up to the point to date. And I just wanted to let you ponder over this question for a while. What do you think might be the most commonly reported limitation of a qualitative study in my pile of jury reports for dissertations? If you think about how people actually spell out the limitations of a qualitative field study, what do we often find? Yeah, come in. Representation, clarify that? Yeah. Like whatever we find is not generalizable to other settings populations. Right. Spot on. It still appears. Yet every time it appears, I question the student about whether or not it is a limitation of qualitative research, because yes, indeed. Yeah, we need to bring specifications, but usually the way it is portrayed is we used a small sample, the sample was purposeful, and therefore it is not generalizable. Yeah. But then you think about what is a limitation actually. A limitation is something that sits in your design that you're supposed to deliver on and that you can't deliver on because of various reasons and motivations. The fact that generalizability is not necessarily part of the goal of a qualitative study can't make it a limitation of qualitative studies. If we do so, and we consider that, then we're actually in a comparative modus again with other paradigms. And then the logical consequence of that would be that in every report of an RCT or a survey, I would put the limitation, oh, well, actually, it's a pity that we didn't go into the depth of the experiences of people on this topic. Does that make sense? Probably not, because that design isn't meant to do that. And that happens when we actually transfer criteria over different paradigms. You know, it reminds me very much on what I would associate with Abraham Maslow's law of the instrument. If all you have is a hammer, then everything looks actually like a nail, even if it isn't. So this describes this cognitive bias of over-relying on a single tool, a single method, a single mindset, causing one to see every problem as requiring one specific solution, even when that is inappropriate. So it illustrates how a familiar approach used by many actually can be exploited in a way that is non-appropriate. And this limits actually the capacity for domains to grow and to develop a vision about what their own intrinsic qualities are. And let me just throw a consequence in there. Like, for example, one principle that is shared across many paradigms is, for example, the notion of neutrality or objectivity. Imagine that we take that as a standard and then we apply it to, let's say, critical participatory design that prioritizes issues like social justice or empowerment and transformative impact, value in things like authenticity, dialogical engagement, and the push towards involving policy to make the conditions of people better. The risk is that when we impose that traditional scientific criteria of objectivity there, it would erase the very subjective, normative, political commitment that is very characteristic of such research. And that actually suggests that we need to think about things that are more unique about that, which brings me to the qualitative part. Because at a certain point you realize that within an evidence-based movement and the criteria developed there, we have to come to prioritize method over the collective concerns in society that we should be tackling. It was the method that determined what sort of questions we could ask and which one could be asked. And in an evidence-based discourse, these were questions related to effectiveness of interventions, because that is the sort of question you can answer with an RCT, which is then considered the gold standard. But the consequence of that is that some questions don't appear on the policy radar, even though they are very important to tackle. And it was at that point that I realized that depending on the sort of question you actually ask or want to tackle, that pyramid of hierarchies actually tips. When your question is about how do people experience X, then there is no such thing as an RCT as the golden standard to tackle that. It's actually tackled by case studies, qualitative layers, and all the rest becomes less important and less robust to work with that particular question. So qualitative, we see the world really different. Reality is much more subjective, socially constructed. Multiple realities can exist at the same time. If we take that window metaphor again, you know, you look at the window, but actually there's a filter in front of the window, which makes you see things differently than someone else. You know, it can be a pink or a black filter, or, you know, there can be spots of rain on the window that doesn't, you know, make it really clear how someone else sees the same reality. So that's a nice metaphor to remember, that there's in that paradigm always a filter through which we approach that particular reality. So the knowledge we gather is much more a co-construction between the researcher and the ones we are speaking to, which means that you actually can't remove yourself from the scene. You have to put yourself in there as an instrument. There is no alternative for the researcher under the form of a questionnaire or some sort of objective standard measure. So you have to throw yourself in there. The best way actually to think about quality in a very mixed group of people is to look out for ways of how certain principles that we are familiar with can be translated into something that works better for a different paradigm. And that's actually a very old model from Guba and Lincoln, one of the core works. And they made that translation for these different terms that we are familiar with from the quant side, turned validity issues into credibility issues, which is actually the confidence that we put in the findings, how well the study actually represents the voices of the people we have spoken to. And if you think about how you can test that or how you can work towards that, we showcase a lot of, let's say, quotations in our reports. They're not there just for cherry picking purposes. They are actually there to support the element of credibility, because if they're not there, if there's no raw evidence in your report, then how am I as a reader supposed to know that whatever you write there doesn't come from your fingertip, but is actually sort of the result of your conversation? So we build in particular measures to improve that credibility or actually showcase that we do credible research. External validity, the generalizability claim, has long been translated in the idea of transferability. Why transferability? I'm very hesitant to say that none of what we produce in qualitative research is actually generalizable to other populations or to other settings. But I like to call it transferability, because what does change is the contextual conditions with which you compare. So if we provide a lot of details about the context in which our study has been done and the events and the critical signals that are present on the scene, then that gives the readers some sort of a guiding compass to see whether the findings that have been found there actually, and the context, compares to what they are actually working in. So transferability claims can be improved by providing detail on the context. And of course, if I do a study about a concept such as loss in a monastery, and I do my field work there, and in one monastery a monk dies, someone goes out of the monastery and marries, and in the other monastery nothing happens on that front, then of course the findings will be different. Is that a problem of generalizability? Probably not. It's the idea that the conditions under which the findings have been retrieved are not the same. And that is how you can inform the reader to make that comparison themselves. Reliability has been translated in dependability, which means we want consistency of findings over time across researchers. And the way we try to work with that is provide transparency about the audit trail we have. We know that there can be variation on how people explain a concept, how they read a fragment and so forth. But what we try to do is make explicit how we understand these concepts, how we understand them differently, and then move forward with that transparency trail. Objectivity, very often translated in conformability as a working concept, so the degree to which findings are shaped by participants and not by researcher bias or interest. We put a lot of measures in place to control for our own impact. For example, we match the ethnicity of reviewers with the ones we are speaking about, so that there's no bias from, a white female woman speaking to males about, erection problems, or white women or white men speaking towards African populations about cultural framing, etc. So that's things that we can do, but we can also work on a data set with multiple people so that different interpretations are actually thrown into the conversation, and that sort of protects us from over or under interpretation. We have a couple of pairs of eyes extra to control for any form of over or interpretation that we could do. So these are small things. Some of the more popular quality appraisal instruments that I often work with are the CASP instrument and the CARI instrument. CASP and CARI both have approximately 10 criteria to look into. They both have been developed by consortia, and they both have been validated as well in different studies. But if you look at the quality of primary qualitative research studies, then these are actually really interesting studies, instruments to look at, and they can guide you into spotting some of the blind spots of the authors, etc. That brings me to art and design related research, and I just wanted to check with people in the room who has been involved in that previously, to some extent. 1, 2, 3, slowly. So that's also how we enter some sort of an area that doesn't necessarily belong to our discipline, but actually infiltrates in our discipline a lot. I, in my career, once encountered this beautiful piece of work. It's called Disrepair, and it was produced by a team led by Mandy Archibald and Blinds. It was created in response to a primary study on the aspect of frailty in elderly populations. And what it does, it provides an interesting counter-narrative of these people that are often portrayed in a very negative sense, as if it is a natural thing to do, to think age in terms of fast decline, and to force people into adopting a status of vulnerability, maybe. So many of the interviews in that study resisted that dominant narrative, bringing a different story that was actually also very complicated to bring to the fore, because they spoke about how these perceptions of people broke them actually inside, and that affected the way they engaged with their life challenges as well. So that was the point where people decided maybe if it's difficult to reframe it because there's such a dominant narrative, can we actually find a different way of bringing that story? And they brought it under the form of a design. And this actually shows the potential of arts research studies to stimulate meaningful reflection upon integration, communication, and to sort of correct for potential misalignments between how we as a researcher label something and how it comes across in the population itself. So instead of doing the review on frailty, I actually started to wonder, what if we would open up our systematic literature reviews to this type of evidence that might not present itself as a paper, but as a tangible dimension, as a tangible piece of evidence that incorporates the voices of many about how it feels to live under that sort of label, frailty. So I revisited my definition of evidence and tried, whenever I tried to look for an alternative way of interpreting the same context, I tried to trace it back to its roots. And the first indicator I found about evidence, or videre, to see out there, was to show clearly, to present something in a way that is easily understood and perceived. So the actual meaning of the word showing here clearly only occurred to me approximately 5 years ago, when we were still in full lockdown period. That's where actually your whole world started to shift, and you became very much aware of even your house being a box. You became much aware of the walls that actually captured you in. I've never had experienced my life in a tangible way that profoundly than when I was locked up in my own house, for example. That's where I understood that there's a different way of agency that we usually don't capture in qualitative research nor in quantitative one, because it's very much focused on the human voice. And I experienced this concept thing power in there. Things or stuff or whatever is here in the environment has its own agency. It acts upon us. The fact that this hall is created in the way it is does throw some sort of a schism between me and you. This is the only setting in which I stand in front of my students. Usually I sit among them. So there's a powerful thing of things in structuring how we act and respond to each other. And that was a very interesting area to discover, I thought. I'm not sure whether you remember that period, but actually COVID-19 was the story of our life, of this decade, and the existing qualitative and quantitative evidence failed us in how we had to deal with that disruption. We all sat down in that bubble. And what I noticed is that many people started to create things. And when do you create, or when are you creatively doing something? That's at the point where you can't really verbalize what is happening to you. You have a sense that it's uncomfortable, but you can't really find the jargon or the words to spit that out. And so that actually brought me to the idea that, if people can't talk about it very easily because it's disruptive and there is no evidence base, why don't we work with these creations? And that's what we actually then started to see as evidence. And if you trace back what happened in that period online, we have lots and lots of libraries, online libraries with drawings, with creations, with images of people that sit there almost like a whole museum that is curated. That's our evidence for the period in which we were actually experiencing that lockdown. And it suggests that there's yet another paradigm behind that curtain that we could consider or reach out to. And that is a reality that is perceived more as fluid, contextual, shaped through creative practice. And that one is really more grounded in the pragmatics of everyday life. It's also very pluralistic. It doesn't necessarily sign itself up for a particular paradigm. It's a reality that is also not fixed. It emerges through interaction with stuff, interpretation, and the thoughts are actually forming itself through the creative act of making. So they don't exist in the aftermath. And this makes knowledge something very experiential, something very embodied. And I quickly noticed that the potential of that arts-based paradigm to step in situations or to study phenomena where people find it difficult to speak. And I've tested it out a couple of times, but typical areas where I would move to this since I've been in COVID-19 is areas where you have issues of shame, where you have, traumatic events that you don't easily speak about, where you have people who are in motion. And when you are in motion, you can't really predict where you land. Like with refugee youngsters, I've used it very successfully to sort of look into what their perspectives were coming from somewhere and then moving towards a future image of their self. So that which goes unspoken is often coming out through a different medium. So my challenge was then to develop some sort of a set of criteria through which we could assess the quality of it, because you can imagine that when you throw that in a university, everyone's in opposition. That is not research. It can't be research. That is creativity. The best way of working with such a tension is to secure that you can defend yourself against invalid critiques. So part of my pathway as a scholar has always been like, okay, I think this is promising. I consider it as research. I'll make sure that I deliver some quality criteria that you can use to judge what I am doing. And that's a very constructive way of sitting with tensions between paradigms. So we came up with a set that was based on 3 layers of quality: normative criteria, substantial criteria, but also, because it is art, performative criteria that actually link the art piece to the public. And these normative criteria are actually quite strongly related to what we call science. So you look at methodological soundness and coherence. The same thing. Does this study has a purpose, a message, a meaning? Is it produced in relation to something that is relevant in terms of questions or issue for creativity, for society? Is it rigorous, trustworthy? Are the art researchers open to critiques, to alternative models of the reality they are creating, and etc.? But also the classical parameters, such as are the people who are creating actually reflexive about it, to prevent from over and under interpretation again, and how do they do that? Does it represent the insight of the people with whom they work? Because a very tricky zone in working with artists is that they want to put their own vision in there very powerfully. So if you're then in a process that is co-creating meaning, you need to sort of, protect that voice issue coming in there. And of course, also that they think about ethical appropriateness criteria. Substantive criteria for arts-based research are very much rooted in the design act itself. For example, what sort of aesthetic standards should such a work have? If you choose a particular medium like visual or audio-visual or dance or theater to bring out a story, what are the quality markers for these modalities? But equally, things like coherence, how is the composition, the display, the organization spelling out in the space in which it is produced, and is that a balanced use of space, or does it oppress other users, etc.? So there's a value system of inclusivity and appropriate use of space in relation to other users that comes in there. And of course, conceptual clarity. Can it be read for its meaning without much support of numbers and narratives, for example? Performative criteria is not something that we usually think of when we evaluate qualitative or quantitative research, but it's about how does a piece of evidence affect us. And I only started to think about performative criteria because I made this assumption that art is meant to spark the interest of the public, and then revisited that for my own studies as well, because then I thought, like, why would, other types of evidence not have the same sort of calling, which is why I now put much more emphasis on public outreach than I used to do in the past. But there's two levels that we found. The power to affect is like, does the work elicit something in the end user in terms of feelings, emotions? Is there some sort of resonance? Can they link it to their own life? Does it make knowledge accessible, for example? Does it raise awareness? Does it influence people's perspectives? And can we sort of measure that as well in the public? The power to affect, of course, does it influence attitudes? That's where often quantitative colleagues come in with some sort of a questionnaire that is able to measure these attitudes before and after an encounter, or just as a cross study design. Does it incite further action, for example? Does it change conditions of people? Does it activate other audience into a particular direction, including policymakers, etc.? And then the leverage is important there. It's situated, this artwork, in some sort of a context, also limited in terms of time and space dimensions, but can it be retrieved and encountered after the first performance? Because our articles are in a depository and anyone can consult them. An art piece is pretty context specific. Do the authors pay attention to the livability of their work beyond the exposition deadline, for example? And it's particular that idea of time and space and how to play with time and space that brought me to the next layer of type of research, which I call speculative research. Speculative research actually explores opportunities, challenges as well, of, for example, new technologies, new models for society, new organizational models. So it co-shapes the future and tries to look for different ways or alternatives to organize things or to approach particular phenomena. And it often does so through prototyping or through building a story or a narrative for how things might look like in the future. And it's a very important move because it moves the question away from what is questions, what is there that we can study in the past and the present, and it moves that question into a what if modus. What if this and this condition is in place, then what can happen? So you can even hypothesize the future, but you can also approach it as a very open project. I wanted to illustrate or talk you through a first example that we did in response to COVID as well, which we called the unthinkable the unthinkable experiment. And I'm gonna say that I was a little bit disobedient there as an academic, and sometimes we have to, because our crew did field work, but we were not supposed to go outside of our own homes. And I felt myself sitting with the tension of safety that was highly promoted by the university, and the mental health of my people that was declining because it took too long and they couldn't go to the field and they felt depressed, etc. So I paired up with an engineering team in Canada, and they created these visor helmets that have an airflow system included in that. That's what you see at the back there. And then we locked ourselves collectively up on a site, an art park in the skirts of Limburg, the mining city. We locked ourselves up for 5 days to think about the question, how can we now live with that virus instead of working against it all the time. So that was a question that really entered our cell or our research group from that disruptive experience. And what we found on site is that we often rely on technology to solve problems. We think that technology is going to solve everything. We now had an opportunity to live that scenario. What if this is a way of living with deadly viruses, that we all wear that thing? And then you do that for 5 days and you realize, no, it's not going to be this scenario. We have to come up with something else. Why? Because simple things like blowing your nose. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? Or just stiffing your lips or doing something, doing something ordinary. So the engineers thought about that. That was the brilliant thing of this. There was this glove that you could put your hand in, and then you could move that hand beyond the screen. So you could blow your nose on the other side with this glove. It just was a very hermeneutic system there. But you feel like it all takes too long. This is not how we're going to organize society, is it? But what resulted from that thinking process was a whole new society in which we build a layer in between for humans to live. So in between the ground floor and the air, there was this layer in between that we could build maybe structures and leave actually the floor for other organisms with which we shared the planet. So that was my first experience there. But it opens the curtain again to a new, more speculative type of research that I didn't encounter before. And that's the last one I will present, but it is a forward-thinking, imaginary, creative approach to inquiry that explores possible futures, sometimes alternative realities like we created, in response to emerging or societal and technological issues. And it's very prominently present in the design sector, in the art sector, but it also spills over to many other domains now, where traditional empirical methods may not be equipped to actually engage with that future thinking idea. It very much starts from the idea that the future is open and non-fixed, and it usually also challenges dominant models, or it challenges dominant strings of solutions for the purpose of bringing meaningful change and sort of anticipating on what we consider a desirable future there. So very often it engages with provocation, rather than perhaps quality measures. Nevertheless, I think it's important, if this enters our faculties and this enters our research agenda, that we again need to think about how you then judge the quality of speculative research that is actually tackling things that are literally not there, not lived yet. So the first question you actually answered is there any real life effect of that speculative research projects possible in generating new knowledge? Because if it's too far in the future, we might as well call it science fiction. Well, actually, I think there is, and I'll give you an example. We've been thinking with some students about how are we going to organize energy supply in the future. And that wasn't a black swan. The question was rooted in the current geopolitical climate, because a couple of years ago, we had this situation where Ukraine was heavily bombarded, and particularly the aggressors targeted the energy infrastructure. So it plunged the whole country into darkness, also in winter, and you could see that actually when you looked at the world mapping. And that sort of brought the question up, how can we make ourselves less dependent on that grid power? And how can we use the power of nature to develop other sort of systems? The outcome of that was not alone stories of how it could be done, but there are also students who are now working on their prototypes. One of the prototypes was a suit made of algae that could cool you down. So if the future becomes hotter, the texture that we are wearing should cool us down. So they use living organisms to create cooling sort of clothing. And that was definitely a spillover effect of these types of research. I'm quickly building on the quality of speculation here, a paper written by colleagues from Germany, Rhonda, Judith, and Mark, who tackled this question about quality criteria that define good speculation and what contributes to the success of that. So they actually defined 3 different angles: speculative qualities, characteristics of that speculative design itself, of course, discursive ones, and process qualities. So as expected, these speculative qualities sit very much on the area of, being fictional, being imaginative, being future-oriented, and proposing something alternative. But also the critical angle of trying to challenge norms is part of how you judge the quality of it. Does it do something differently, and where is that rooted in? And social, political value of what they do. Also, discursive qualities relate much more to experienceability. Does it bring some sort of a tangible idea, an image of the future that we can connect to? And is that thought-provoking enough so that it sparks further conversation, for example? And then there's, of course, the process. Is that process grounded in the realities of things? Does it incorporate, for example, a macro-historical trend analysis that provides a basis to think through? Is it rooted in a disruptive event, etc.? So what is the occasion here? Is it participative so that it invites multiple voices there? Is it reflective enough? And also the element of playfulness that draws people in there is a criterion that popped up in that one. Before I move further, I actually wanted to check on the time, because this is also where my curtain has opened fully and where we could also choose to maybe engage in some questions and conversations. So, Benoit, you can inform me. Okay. It's what you like. So we can go into public outreach, but we can also, end the story here and then engage in some conversation amongst us. So if you feel like you're saturated, we're very close to the end of the presentation, then please, we can enter the conversation. Well, it might be another 10 minutes. Okay. Luckily, there's a lot of overlap when you talk about outreach and impact, and you compare that to arts-based research. There's a common core there. Many times when we do public outreach, we use different modalities and modes to speak to the public and to draw them in. There's a particular reason why I think we should invest a little bit more also in public outreach, and that is the whole digitalization movement. Our landscape in who speaks about what and with what authority has fundamentally changed, not only because we are now more laterally connected in the way we deal with knowledge or the sources we consult, but also under the impulse of the citizen science movement. So citizens are no longer the receivers of our knowledge only, they actually contribute to knowledge and they make knowledge. So they become co-creators in knowledge creation. And that's why I think that public outreach, when we engage in it, should have this sort of interactive component to it. So when we thought about criteria for public outreach, we took that into account as some sort of our baseline measure for public outreach. So you'll see that sit there, and that's an intentional choice to honor some of these trends in society and work with them instead of filtering them out. So how do we best safeguard the quality of science translation to citizens? What is a successful, valuable form of public science dissemination, if you like? We created sort of a checklist for you. I'm not going to run you through all of these components, but I'm picking one out, which is the whole idea of how you translate content and how you represent and what quality markers in there are. So obviously we're talking about the complexity of translation and issues such as understandability. How can you increase that understandability? for example, by creating feedback loops that helps the public see how particular things connect to each other, rather than presenting it as a linear trail of evidence where no negotiation is possible. I mean, if we speak to the public, I know we all have the desire with our studies to close down arguments, but our job is also, I guess, with the evidence we collect, to open up conversations. And that is actually what we try to stimulate in public outreach. We think it's important to think very clearly what is the best mode of presenting these meanings, these insights to people. And there's a lot of modes that we can use, ranging from the visual over the textual, over even embodied ways of connecting people with installations in the public sphere. There can be sound. Some people absorb sound and speaking much easier, etc. So it's a way of reflecting, why am I choosing a medium and for what purpose and what is it supposed to do. Let me skip the rest because you have the reference and we'll send that one probably to you. But what I wanted to stress is that when you engage in public outreach and you do this beautiful review and you publish it on paper, but you then not honor the principles of public outreach while you are producing it, then maybe that's not a good motivation for others to start. So what we did is we translated all these criteria for public outreach, quality criteria, in some sort of a card deck that you could download, you could print them, and then you could play with these cards in trying to make sense of public outreach efforts for you. So that's a way of honoring some of the principles of playfulness, of tangibility, of playing with visual modes, etc., in our own work. So if you're interested and you're involved in public outreach efforts, do check the criteria, but also consider the card deck to play around with colleagues in judging that quality. Maybe that's my last message then. Quality means doing right when no one is looking. I've invested a lot of my scholarly time in creating quality criteria by which others can judge the work of others. So it always comes in a post hoc fashion. But do think about the idea that you can use these quality markers also while you are conducting your research, so that you actually are already familiar with how it will be judged. So more than using them as an evaluation instrument, I use them to guide my study, to guide my public outreach, because it protects me from critiques from others. And that's also an invitation to you. Consider that as a way of using quality criteria checklists. Thank you. That was a very long story. I hope it resonated in some parts with what you are doing and sparked some interest in checking either the criteria or the designs that we've presented today. And I'll hand it over to you.
Many thanks. Yes. Can you circulate the microphone? Yes, so we have quite some time for questions and answers or reflections, suggestions, contributions, critiques, challenges, anything. So yes, please.
Thanks. I really hate speaking into my phone. Thank you so much for this presentation. It really resonated with a lot of the things that I'm doing. And I did a review on participatory methods and how they work. And I was really looking for like the critical reflections on those methods in the paper. And it was the most frustrating work ever, because like the only thing that I could find in the limitation section was it's not generalizable. But then like the reflections on the methods were missing. But I was thinking that I couldn't imagine that researchers were just so not critical or lacked so much creativeness to not report like the more participatory part and what is happening on participation. And yeah, when I started trying to publish myself, then I noticed that because of the word count, often like this was a part that was getting eliminated. So I was wondering, is it then just the lack of the criteria, or is it also like the space that we get to reflect on our methods, and especially with qualitative research, I think it takes a lot of space.
The space issue is the easy one. Let me tackle that one first and then come back to your disappointment in a second. I'm aware of the space issue, but in my work, it no longer plays. And the reason why it no longer plays is that we made so much progress on the level of how we dispatch information through digital forums that it's perfectly thinkable that whatever you can't place in the word count comes into an annex. And I must admit that my annexes sometimes are longer than the article itself. But there's so much linkage opportunities nowadays that you can permit yourself to sort of store whatever you think the reader needs to interpret your story correctly on a local server in your university, in your research group, wherever you want to place it, where it is sustainable, and then link people through. So there's a very pragmatic solution for that. So think about and if you feel like you have to instruct that to the editorial base, then do so, because it also makes them think about, yeah, maybe we should organize our portal differently. And that's what happens. So when you propose something in a very constructive way to deal with a problem, it makes people reflect. If you sit with the problem and think like, oh my God, I have to reduce all this and I'm going to lose my content, then you're actually playing whatever standard there is now, but you're not thinking for future generations. So that's my first invitation. If there is a solution, just propose it. And people are very willing to listen to that. They might come back not in the first 6 months, but thank you for the suggestion. And that's what I often do. It's like being playing a bit of courtesy in scholarship. You know, you court someone with an idea and you enter a conversation. We lost that capacity over time because things have become too bureaucratic and we don't think we can change. We can change things if there are enough voices to step up. That's the easy part. The part on the participatory research, which I also situated in critical types of qualitative research paradigms, there is a checklist available for that helps people think through what the value of it is and how that translates in quality. I can't remember the name, but it is in one of my papers of 20 years ago. So it's a long history of thinking about quality of participatory research. But what often happens there, and I plead guilty as well, I'm a co-creator, I'm a participatory scholar, is that we start with this theory and this big claim and this rationale that we're going to change things. And I've done a review on participatory or community-based projects to actually evaluate whether people pull that through in practice. And what you then see is papers with a clear rationale, a clear method, but without evaluation of whether the change was reached at all and whether there was any change in any dimension, either personally or culturally or structurally or. The reason for it is that we think research too much in terms of 4 years. That's our project logic, isn't it? You know, you've got 4 years and then people say like, oh, I didn't have the time anymore. If you're committed to co-creation, to community and participatory research, and you value these relationships to the core, then these relationships don't stop the moment you deliver your project. They are actually cultivated and you have time to work with them, but you need to be willing of positioning yourself into something has consequences. If you position yourself as a co-creative community-based researcher that does participatory research, buckle up and expect a sudden delay. And so I think that the problem is the time dimension. We can if we want to, but we won't because the time is finished. And that's what we need to challenge our universities in, and also ourselves. A lot of what my students do in the aftermath of their PhD is working with these people to actually put the change in motion. And many of them are still part of these communities. And many of these people still come to our offices. It's a long-term relationship. So don't be blocked or bounded by artificial boundaries that don't hold for particular traditions. But there is energy that you need to conceptualize outside of working hours. And that might be disruptive for some, but that's part of the story, I think.
If I may bounce back before I give you the floor. At UC Louvain here, there is a quite large-scale plan. One of the farms on the former farmland where we're located now is called Ferme de Lozelle. And they have a really ambitious project for the next many years to bridge science, agriculture, and culture/arts. So it would be a knowledge production place, a physical production place for food, actually for the region, plus a place where artists will be also, and this will be integrated. And they've begun to do some mix, some first, let's say, crossing points. For instance, is having performance artists and dancers and photographers operating within laboratories. These kind of things, right? Where there is a dialogue between, and the performance informs something, also for researchers. Just a testimony.
Benoit brings back this idea of lateral thinkers, right? Where you create a space that isn't bounded by academic borders, but where you actually open up. I think that's a model that has much potential for the future, particularly because I think what we call knowledge systems is also strongly shifting in society. You know, there's new knowledge bases coming in that we wouldn't have considered 20 or 10 years ago. So I think it's a logical extension of this idea that we don't own knowledge as academics, but that it is a shared endeavor with society and all the stakeholders that are in there. Yeah.
And so before I give you the floor, just my second point was in observing your itinerary. If I may make a proposal, if it seems to me that in a way you started your itinerary with experiments in a certain tradition, right? Not also with a very framed form of experiment, right? And within a very institutionalized perspective, and you loop back to, in fact, another way to do experiments. The single disruptive experiment. Mm-hmm. So not only speculative, but also sometimes really by testing. So but it's a single experiment, right? Not designed to be reproduced in the same logic as you would do in your initial training, correct?
Yeah, you're right. It's often the difference between calling yourself an applied researcher where you work with the systematicity of an existing database where you make small changes to adjust to the context, or positioning yourself as a developer of methods. If you are a developer of methods, you actually always push the edge of what exists. So you don't have that systematicity yet. It needs to sort of be created and unfolded. It unfolds on the side, but it's largely the systematicity comes from the reflection with the team about what you went through, and then finding some hooks in that storyline that says, like, these were the productive elements in there. Let's think about that. How can we sort of make this or turn this into a systematicity that allows other people to work with what we've done? But the moment you start to develop something, there are seeds, but there's no outline. So it's really the difference between designing methods or applying and refining and testing and implementing and evaluating methods. It's a totally different field of scholarship, but it's a fun part to sit in a sense.
So thank you for a really provocative presentation. I have a comment, and there's an implicit question embedded in it about generalization. So I think I want to argue that the criteria you shared over-acknowledge the accomplishment of generalization in quantitative methods and under-acknowledge the potential in qualitative and your arts-based and your speculative. So Charles Reagan, for instance, argued that back in the 80s that every study is situated in space and time. And so that every study could, in fact, be considered a case study. And the sort of outcome of that is the notion that it's the theory that carries the generalization. And if you look back, say, to even Campbell and Stanley in the 1950s, how they present external validity really of experiments really focuses on the theory carrying the generalization. And I see resonances of that in comparative case study research of all kinds and in systematic reviews, including what looked to be the one, a review that you were presenting around your criteria for the speculative. And I worry about underselling the potential of generalization for these other approaches to research.
Okay. Yeah, I can respond to, I think, both components. I don't think we are saying something different. We might have presented it in a different way. But indeed, on the theory level, I think there's a difference between grand theories, grand narratives, like, for example, new materialism, that provides almost a philosophical framework through which you can look at society, and no matter which phenomenon is there, you can always find the theoretical traces in there. So once you adopt a grand theory, like it could also be positivism or it could also be something else, but or symbolic interactionism, when you master it, you can't see society outside of that theory anymore, and it explains most of the things you see. But what I see in, for example, more quantitative strings is a different use of theory. Perhaps the theories there are more substantial in the sense that it brings together a couple of variables, but it doesn't move towards these grand narratives. And that is because it's highly rooted in this idea of I have to test a hypothesis there. So yes, I think grand narratives explain most of the complexity of society if you master them well, but they are not suitable to be used in every type of, let's say, project that you're engaged with, or they're not suitable for every type of question, to my opinion. The other aspect was about, the underemphasis of generalizability for qualitative research. The way I instruct my students is when, for example, let's take an example of a well-developed qualitative design, such as grounded theory, very systematically, it's open, but there's a stepwise approach, you know what you have to do, etc. When a model comes out of such a study that is really pushing to saturation, then when my students enter a conversation with their quants, people on the floor, making the claim that it's not generalizable, then I usually respond to them, okay, give them an opportunity to prove you wrong. And some took up that challenge of trying to dig out the relationships that a model brings. Most of the time, it holds. So that suggests that many of the things that we produce in qualitative research are actually transposable, transferable to other settings, and particularly when it's about things like stress. Why would stress unfold itself very differently in different countries or with different populations? I don't believe in that. So I follow you in the idea that it's a distractor, that actually I start doubting the models I create the moment I am challenged by another researchers. So I think the whole idea of transferability, generalizability, is a dialogue that unfolds between scholars that actually look at the same thing, but but from different dimensions. So I link that sort of discussions very much to the idea of triangulation, if you like, but on the level of that quality claim. That's usually how I try to settle discussion lines there, if you like.
Just one quick follow-up, and then I'll be the notion of theory carrying the generalization can also mean that theory carries the representation of the kinds of differences across cases. So your answer seemed like it was kind of that generalizability, transferability, it had a kind of a honing in on a concept sense.
Yeah.
And theory can articulate difference, and that can be quite useful to folks in context to consider the range of differences and how differences matter differently in different contexts.
Yeah, it always brings us at the layer of where, theory is actually used to explain mechanisms. Yeah, but then again, what you bring in as a theory to explain the mechanisms that you see is a choice, and it might equally lead to over or under interpretation of a phenomenon, because I could have chosen another one that situates things differently. So even with theories, we have to be careful not to end up with something that overemphasizes a particular element that we read through the theory, but in fact isn't there or isn't real if you go back to how people speak about it. So when we use theory, I think the idea of member checking, whether you interpret things right, whether you situate things right, even whether it's theoretical or atheoretical, it corrects for that sort of overassumption as well. So again, I think quality markers protect us from many different critiques, and they spill over to different segments in our designs, I think. But you're right.
Yes.
There's power in that.
We should conclude quite soon. One question there. I wanted to bounce back on the issue of generalizability. When I do teach these issues to my students, my first recommendation is to step back and reflect a bit on the concept of generalization, right? And the way you can, of course, approach it from narrow conceptions, such as statistical inference, which is a very strong but narrow approach, and to broader approach to do generalization, right?
Yeah.
And secondly, for those who are more advanced, and also when I discuss with researchers, I advise them to consider things like comparative process tracing, right? When you very carefully select 2 cases or 3 cases across a space of diversity, right? And you document and you demonstrate with deep evidence, right, the existence of some causal mechanisms in those 2, 3, 4 cases. Then, in a certain logical space, right, you can make quite strong statements in terms of extension, right, towards other potential cases. That kind of logic, right?
Yeah.
So my point is there are multiple ways to think about generalization. That's what I'm saying.
Indeed, yeah. I mean,
it's just a teaser in complement. One last point.
Okay, yeah. Karin, thank you so much for this very, very interesting presentation, which is also very relevant to me, as I'm currently also working on quality criteria for mixed methods research. And there is one interesting thing about those criteria. While currently many criteria are okay, the quantitative part should meet the quantitative criteria, the qualitative part should meet the qualitative criteria, and then we have criteria for how the two combine. And I think that's not enough to me. One thing that's also very important is the idea of getting the most out of your data, so that you are able to show that you got the most out of the data sources that you use, because that's why you bring them together. But now I also realize that that's connected to the idea of impact, because if you try to get the most out of your data, your research will become more usable in practice. So I have one example. If you have an intervention and you say, okay, yes, this intervention did have an effect point, then practitioners cannot do very much with it. Whereas if you have follow-up with qualitative research and you really combine them, then it has more impact will have more impact for practice. And I also noticed that I think that several of the criteria that you showed also will have an importance outside of speculative research or outside of artistic research. So thank you so much.
Yeah, the mixed method area is not something I touched upon today, but indeed many models would separate because that's the easy thing to do. But nevertheless, there is also a voice in the primary research tradition that would make the claim that we need to think and cut across with a set of generalizable criteria. And sometimes by, separating us too much in our own bin, we lose sight of what we actually share as a methods community, as a research community. So I applaud these attempts, particularly for mixed methods. But there are ways of thinking across, of course. Criteria such as where is the weight situated between these paradigms and what is the impact of that on the story. It could also be simple things like how is it integrated, and does the integration actually produce additional value in how you frame the story, for example. But even the basic things like thinking about what is responsible research in a mixed method tradition and how do we deal with ethical layers of combining streams of evidence from different paradigms that might at first sight be non-comparable. How do we deal with that on the level of value creation, etc.? So if we think that through, and if someone would invest in that, and we should speak about that, I think, I guess there will be a common noun that is usable for all study designs, in a sense, particularly when you talk about responsible research and what that means in terms of quality markers.
Yeah. Thank you. One small thing I would like to add is, yes, within the mixed method tradition, there is the idea that the two should be integrated. They should be integrated well, but really specific criteria on what does it mean to be integrated well are then, so to speak, missing in the frameworks. Only that they should be integrated.
Well, yeah, there are some leads. But it always comes down, and we didn't push ourselves far enough there to, we're going to translate the quantitative into something qualitative, and then we can summarize that together, or the other way around. We're going to quantify some of the qualitative stuff, and then that facilitates that integration. I think the way forward with that is that we have to think much more not as an interaction, but as a sort of assemblage. Brings me back to new materialism. If you think mixed or multi-methods as an assemblage of things of which the researcher and the reviewer team is also a part, because that integration will be our responsibility, then perhaps different images of how integration can be done might emerge from there. So that's a lead that I would give you to work with or to play with, if you like.
Yeah. I agree.
So many thanks again. So let us thank again the colleague for the intervention. Thank you. I would so thanks a lot for this and also for the very rich slides and very, very thought-provoking proposals and actionable proposals, right? It's not only about thinking, it's actually taking action, right? Okay, so two remarks on behalf of the conference committee for the program, just two heads up, in addition to the regular panel sessions and so on. So today at 2:30, from 2:30 to 4, there are 6 parallel community sessions. And you will be informed by each group of co-conveners how this will happen, how this will be managed internally in each session. So the logic is that each one of you simply picks the community in which he or she feels, or wants to engage with. And the whole idea of these sessions is to either discuss some actual topics related to these broad areas of methodologies, but also to discuss about very concrete ways in which the community could develop in the next few months, and with the support of MethodsNET, of this MethodsNet team, to make these vibrant spaces for dialogue, co-creation, collaboration, etc. Also, with the view of feeding some elements of the program for the next conference next year, and potentially also for innovative topics for courses for our summer school in 2026. All right, so that's kind of a broad agenda, but each community will work in, let's say, in an organic manner, self-organization, bottom-up. And I will get feedback from the meeting organizers from each of the 6 sessions, and I will kind of summarize this in the concluding session on Friday, to kind of wrap up and try to tease out some common points, perhaps some potential collaborations. That's the first point. I was a bit long, perhaps, but at least so you get the idea. And secondly, we have also tomorrow, I lost my window. Yeah. And we will have tomorrow in the morning slot between, I think, yes, between 10:30 and 12, for those who are still around. We will have, in parallel with 3 other sessions, the Meet the Experts speed dating session. It's an original format. We'll see how many people are interested. So you will receive, or you have received today, but sometime today, a very short form in which you will be asked to engage, if you want to join this session, either as an expert with a few, let's say, a few keywords of your expertise, or as a user/learner with points that you're interested in, and we'll do a matching based on responses. So there will be a deadline for your responses. It's a very short questionnaire, like 3-4 questions, and just tick some boxes. And then we will organize this tonight, so that we can do this matching exercise for this session. Okay? Thanks a lot. And now is a lunch break. After intellectual food, now real food.